I'm Vincent Vernuccio, Senior Policy Advisor for Labor for Workers for Opportunity and the Mackinac Center. Welcome to Labor Policy 101. We are going to have a fun adventure, and yes, I said fun, and we're going to talk about some of the basics of labor policy and some ideas of advancing worker freedom, protecting workers, and also taxpayers. In this video, we will go over the current state of union membership, the differences between public and private sector unions, basic terms and concepts in labor law, the union election process, federal labor law and the agencies that administer it. We'll also go over the Janus versus AFSCME decision that brought worker freedom to public employees across the country. Finally, we'll end with examples of those policies that can help workers, taxpayers, and job creators. So let's go. Let's start with the current state of union membership. In 2012, union membership hit its lowest percentage of the American workforce since 1916. In 2020, and this is the latest percentages that we have available, 10.8% of all workers were members of a union. We're talking about 14.3 million workers. Now, this is not to be confused with workers who are represented by a union. That percentage is actually 12.1%. Now, I don't want you to get confused, once again, the difference between members and represented. Members are full dues-paying members. These are workers that have chosen to join a union, that are paying the union, unfortunately in right-to-work states where unions could actually get workers fired for not paying them, they're forced to pay agency fees if they don't want to pay the union. For public employees, and we'll get to Janus versus AFSCME in a few minutes, they don't have to pay. And in right-to-work states, those private sector workers, they don't have to pay either. But if they're under a union contract, they're considered represented by a union. So that's the difference between joining a union, paying full dues, being a union member, and being represented by a union. Now, breaking these numbers down a little further, 6.3% of private sector workers are union members. That's over 7 million workers. 34.8% of public employees are union members, and that's 7.1 million and change. Now, once again, don't worry. These are the only statistics we're going to go over in this video. Now let's shift over and start talking about policy. But before we get there, let's talk about where those numbers came from. This can also help you with your union research. There's two ways to find this information easily. First is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every January, they put out their union membership survey. That's taken from Census Bureau data and a couple other sources. There's also another website where you can find all this information called unionstats.com that's put out by two professors where they get even more granular in some of the data. So the first is the union membership survey put out by the Department of Labor, and you can just Google Department of Labor union membership survey and find it. And the second is unionstats.com. Now, if you do want to do this research and you do need help with it, feel free to reach out to the Mackinac Center or Workers for Opportunity, and we'll be able to help you crunch those numbers. And if you really want to delve into it deeper, you can always do FOIA, and there are ways to really delve into it, but that's a little more labor intensive. Let's talk about the difference between public sector and private sector. Essentially, those are the two basic types of labor law. First, let's talk about private sector. That is generally governed by federal labor law. Besides right to work, there's not much in a private sector wise that you can do when it comes to unions on a state level. So to put this in perspective for all you Steve Carell fans out there, I want you to think The Office. That's private sector. That's federal labor law. Now, if you're at the state level trying to enact different policies, you're mostly going to be dealing with public sector labor law. Public sector, except for federal employees, that's governed by the state. So you're talking about your state employees, your local municipal employees, teachers, public safety, local bureaucrats, state bureaucrats. That's all state level labor law. Now, staying with the analogy, instead of The Office, for state level public sector, I want you to think Parks and Rec. Now that we've determined the difference between public sector and private sector, there still is some crossover, and I want to go through some basic terms and concepts that you're going to have to get familiar with when dealing with labor law. First is a concept called exclusive representation. This is where a union gets a monopoly to represent all employees and to negotiate for all employees. Once again, going back to that members versus represented, it doesn't matter if the worker is a member of the union, whether they want union representation or not, they're stuck under the union contract, and that union has a monopoly to represent all of the workers in what's known as a unit. That's exclusive representation. Now, what is a collective bargaining unit? A collective bargaining unit, at least in the private sector, and there's a lot of crossover between what state public sector labor law does in relation to the private sector. So for shorthand, I'm just going to talk about the private sector and know that chances are, unless you're in an outlier state, that your state is going to be probably pretty similar with public sector. So with private sector, a collective bargaining unit is determined by what's known as a community of interest standard. So what that means is that you have similar employees at a similar job site. They're all considered one unit, and because they're considered one unit, they're under one contract represented by a union, and that union will get a monopoly over all of those employees in the unit, both from a representation standpoint and a contract negotiation standpoint. Now, when they do get that contract, or when they've actually petitioned, and we'll get into how a union comes to be in a minute, an employer has what's known as the duty to bargain in good faith. So what is the duty to bargain in good faith? I want to do an analogy for you. Now, let's forget about HOAs and things like that. Let's just say somebody comes to your house, knocks on your door, and says, well, a majority of your neighbors have told me that they want me to paint their house. Now, forgetting HOAs or anything like that, you have the freedom to say, no, I don't want my house painted, take a hike. If that were in the union context and there was that duty to bargain in good faith, union says, hey, we've got a majority, now you have to start negotiating over what color paint, when they're going to start, how much, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The duty to bargain in good faith means that an employer, or a union for that matter, can't say, hey, we're not negotiating with you. They have to, like the name implies, bargain in good faith. And why are they bargaining in good faith? Well, they need to get to a contract. A term of art that you'll probably hear very often is a collective bargaining agreement. That's just a union contract between the union and the employer. It's called the collective bargaining agreement, or a CBA. Now, either within the CBA or generally within law, and on the state level, these actually can get pretty prescriptive. There's a thing called unfair labor practices, ULPs. What is a ULP? It's essentially saying things that either the employer or the union cannot do, that's a violation of the contract or a violation of either state or federal labor law, or it's topics that are off limits. And there's actually 3 different types of topics that are either negotiable or not negotiable. These are considered prohibited subjects of bargaining. This is something that you cannot bargain over, that's specifically excluded from bargaining. And at the state level, these can be things like public employee discipline, the length of a school day, things like that. In the private sector, it's much more narrow. There's something known as permissive subjects of bargaining. These are things that can be negotiated over, but don't have to be. Which brings us to the next thing, what has to be negotiated? Those are mandatory subjects of bargaining. Wages, hours, things like that, especially in the private sector, those are known as mandatory subjects of bargaining. So those are the 3 types of subjects that either cannot be bargained, that's prohibited subjects, may be bargained, permissive subjects, or must be bargained, mandatory subjects. But before we even get to ULPs, before we get to the collective bargaining agreement, we have to have an election process. or the union has to be chosen. So once again, I'm not going to get into state-specific details. Many states mirror this, but let's talk about how a union is formed in the private sector. So there's really two main ways. The first way is by a secret ballot election. And the way to trigger a secret ballot election is that a union will get roughly 30%, about a third of the employees within a collective bargaining unit, and they will go to a federal agency, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but I don't want to give anything away, and say, hey, we've got 30% or we've got a third. We want to have a secret ballot election. For the most part, that usually does not happen. Here's what usually happens. If the union knows there's going to be an election, they try to get 60, 70, some vast majority, because if there's going to be an election, they know there's going to be attrition. And if there's attrition, they still want to know they're going to win. So they'll go and they'll get that vast majority. They'll go to the employer whose decision it is right now to say, yes, I want an election, or I'm going to recognize the union. They will say, no, I want an election. They'll go to that federal agency, and the federal agency will administer the election. We'll get into some of that nitty-gritty detail in a second. But the second way is a process called card check. And I know you've probably heard about card check. It's in several attempts by unions to enact by federal legislation. Essentially, it's an open petition process. So just like unions had to get cards signed to show that they had that 30% or majority went to the Federal Labor Board to trigger the election, they can actually get 50% plus one, go to the employer and say, recognize us. Now, if the employer wants to, they can say, sure, I see you have a majority. I'm just going to recognize you and start bargaining. Now, you're probably saying, well, wait a minute. What happens to the workers here? They're denied an election? That's exactly what card check is. Workers do not get the privacy and the protection of a secret ballot if a union organizes via card check. And what makes matters worse is there are scores of examples of unions abusing this process. We've seen cards collected through deception, saying, well, just sign this, sign up for this raffle, or sign up for more information about the union, and then a little 6-point font on the bottom of that card is, I hereby authorize the union to represent me. So without even realizing it, a worker could sign a card and say, this union's going to represent me. The union gets 50% plus one, goes to the employer, and the employer will then recognize the union. And like we just spoke about with exclusive representation, now that worker must accept that union monopoly on negotiations. Unfortunately, other things that we've seen are unions using intimidation tactics, consistent visits to an employee's home, literally threatening employees' cars, or other things, saying, sign this card and we'll go away. If you don't, well, we'll see what happens. So card check is vastly inferior to a secret ballot election. But unfortunately, that is the other way that unions can organize and get a monopoly and represent all employees within that unit. Okay, well, I promised you no more numbers, but unfortunately, I did not promise no more acronyms. So now we get into federal labor alphabet soup. We're going to go through a couple different agencies and a couple different statutes and how they're abbreviated. So first, we're going to start with the National Labor Relations Act. This is known as the NLRA. This covers most private sector employees. Disputes go before the NLRB. See, I told you there's going to be a lot of letters in this section. I'm sorry. The NLRB, that's that federal agency I was telling you about that administers those union elections. That's the National Labor Relations Board. It's a 5-member board. It is highly political. Essentially, the party of the president, they get 3 members of the 5-member board. So as you can imagine, the policies of the NLRB vary greatly between president to president. Moving away from the NLRA, we move now to the RLA, the Railway Labor Act. As it sounds, this is federal law. It covers private sector employees in the railroad, but also the airline industry. So for the most part, those private sector employees that are not covered by the NLRA are covered by the RLA, the Railway Act. Disputes go before the National Mediation Board, or NMB, which, like the NLRA, is a board consisting of, in this case, 3 members, 2 from the president's party, 1 from the party that does not control the presidency. There are swings on the NMB, but it's not as wild as we usually see with the NLRB. Moving now to yet another statute with an abbreviation, the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, the LMRDA. Now, this is one of our favorite statutes because this gives us the union transparency reports. The biggest one there, of course, I think a lot of you know, is the Form LM2. And there is just a wealth of information for workers on these LM forms, specifically the LM2. First and foremost, they disclose officer salaries, employee salaries, union assets, union loans, union receipts, union membership levels, a host of information. Receipts and disbursements above $5,000 are all itemized, so you can see exactly where the union is spending their money with major purchases. If they're getting a receipt or disbursement from one vendor, that's under $5,000, but in aggregate it's over $5,000. So you have essentially, one transaction that's $2,600, another transaction that's $2,500. That also has to be disclosed, and then there's another line for everything else. But unfortunately, I have bad news. If there are not private sector employees somewhere within the union hierarchy, they're not going to file these LM forms. So if you are looking for union transparency or union financial disclosure on a state or local level, unless there is a private sector employee somewhere within the hierarchy, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get that unless your state has a union transparency law. Now, the good news is that in most states, at least at the state level, and for pretty much every large national public sector union, there is a private sector employee somewhere within that hierarchy, and then you will get those LM forms. Now, the first place to go if you're researching union financials is a website called unionreports.gov. That's unionreports.gov. It's a site maintained by the Department of Labor, and that houses all of these private sector or even public sector, but with private sector member, union financial forms. If you do need help going through these forms or you want more information, there is a great video on workersforopportunity.org, the Workers for Opportunity website. So I would encourage you to visit that website, look at that video if you want more information on the LM2, or of course you can reach out to us at the Mackinac Center or Workers for Opportunity, and we can walk you through how to read an LM. So let's talk about right to work. What is it? Right to work simply means that a union cannot get a worker fired for not paying them. And I'm specifically talking here about private sector workers, and once again, we'll get into the difference there in a second. But in the over half of the states, 27 as of 2021, that have enacted a right to work law, private sector workers in those states cannot get fired for not paying a union. Now, if you want to get into kind of the nitty-gritty, wonky way to describe it, it's that a worker cannot be required to pay a union as a condition of employment. What does that mean? It means that the union can't say, hey, this worker is not paying us, you have to get them fired. Now, it does not change collective bargaining in any other way. Unions and workers can still negotiate, and private sector workers can still negotiate over wages, hours, working conditions, anything they can negotiate over before a right to work law, they can negotiate for after a right to work law, except for the ability of the union to say, hey, you have to force them to pay us. But the impact of that is really telling. You look at right to work states and you compare them to their non-right to work state counterparts. And right to work states have higher job growth. They have lower unemployment. They have higher wage growth. And when you factor in cost of living, workers are actually making more. Now, what is cost of living? Cost of living is you compare groceries, you compare taxes, you compare gas. It's the cost of living in one area versus another. So these numbers are starting to smooth out because we have seen a huge influx in right-to-work states over the last few years. But historically, unions love to say right-to-work means right to work for less. Well, so what were they doing? They were comparing workers in New York to, let's say, a worker in Alabama. Now, if you look at New York City, you can imagine how much rent is versus a mortgage in Selma, Alabama. But what unions were saying is, oh, that worker in New York is making more, so aha, because Alabama's a right-to-work state, it means that workers are going to get paid less because of right to work. It is simply untrue. When you factor in cost of living, workers are actually making more, and even that distinction is starting to change because we have seen such an influx in right-to-work states. What the best number to look at is after a state enacts a right-to-work law, you look at wages, you look at income, and they all go up. And not only do they go up, but they usually outpace the non-right-to-work states. So let's back up for a second and let's talk about what happens in a non-right-to-work state. Now, what you really have to remember here is that even in a non-right-to-work state, no one is forced to join a union. There's a catch, though. You don't have to join the union, but you have to pay the vast majority of those dues in what are known as agency fees. And that can be as high as 60, 70, 80, 90% or more in fees that have to go to the union, but you're not a member. Now, the difference between dues and agency fees is that essentially you're not paying for direct union politics, but once again, there's a catch. The unions can still do what's known as internal communication, which can be very political, and as an agency fee payer, you're forced to subsidize that. And of course, as we all know, money is fungible, so even though you're not paying full dues, and technically you're not paying for direct political advocacy by the union, you're still essentially subsidizing it in a non-right-to-work state where you can't fully say, no, union, I'm not going to pay you. Now, all of this applies to the private sector because of a landmark Supreme Court decision in 2018 called Janus versus AFSCME. The Janus versus AFSCME decision basically brought right-to-work rights for public employees across the country. It said that everything that public sector unions do is political. And because everything that public sector unions do is political, public employees across the country have a First Amendment right to choose to pay for that politics or not. So we're not just talking about direct political advocacy here. What do public sector unions negotiate over? Well, if it's salaries, what is that? That's taxpayer dollars. Whether it's working conditions, whether it's the number of parking spaces at a school, what is that? That is public policy. All of that, the Supreme Court said, is political, and because it's political, those public employees have a First Amendment right to choose to pay or not, and essentially they have right to work now because of that Janus versus AFSCME decision. But the decision actually went one step further. After they said everything that public sector unions do is political and public employees have a First Amendment right to choose to pay or not, they also said that in order to collect dues, and I know this is going to be a shocker to a lot of you, that employees have to opt in, that they have to say, yes, I actually want to be a member and I want to pay the union. Justice Alito, who wrote the opinion, said that in order to collect dues, there has to be what he called evidence of affirmative consent, or essentially, employees have to opt in. Now, there's been several attorney generals across the country that have said that what is that evidence of a affirmative consent? What is that opt-in? It comes down to several different points. The first point is that the employee has to opt in, especially if they're getting dues money taken out of their paycheck. The public employee has to opt in directly to their employer. There has to be evidence, whether it's written or electronic, there has to be evidence directly to the employer. And to make sure that there's no fraud or forgery, the employer has to confirm it. So essentially, like you sign up for a bank account or even an email list. You get an email saying, hey, did you really want to do this? Click yes. It can be that simple. The next thing these attorney generals have said is that employees need to be informed of their rights. Once again, choosing to pay a public sector union or not, according to the Supreme Court, is a First Amendment right. And if you choose not to pay, you're not waiving your First Amendment right as if you are paying the union. So there has to be a disclaimer to public employees, hey, you have a First Amendment right not to pay. And one of the last things that the attorney generals have said is that opt-in, that consent, it has to be contemporaneous. So many attorney generals across the country have said in order to be contemporaneous, essentially the employee has to opt in annually or once a year, give or take, in order to say, yes, I'm aware of First Amendment right, I choose to opt in, I've confirmed that. That has to happen essentially on a yearly basis. And once again now, we are unfortunately only talking about public employees, but it is public employees across the entire country, including union-heavy states such as California, Illinois, or New York. And that's Janus versus AFSCME. Right to work now applies to private sector unions, says for private sector unions that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. In conclusion, with Janus, what several states are doing is they're actually enacting opt-in legislation. After the Janus decision was handed down, states across the country, they said, yes, we have to allow employees the option to pay the union, for public employees, the option to pay the union or not, but not many saw that opt-in portion of the case. Thankfully, now many attorney generals, as we've already spoke about, have said this is what Justice Alito meant, this is what came out of the Supreme Court case, and many states are now looking into adopting legislation to further enhance those rights of public employees. And that opt-in legislation is being looked at. It's already been enacted in Indiana, and it's being looked at in many other states. So to recap, we've talked about the current state of unions. We've talked about the difference between public sector and private sector. We've talked about who administers labor policy for them at a federal level. We've talked about right to work, and we've talked about Janus. But now comes the really fun part. What other policies can be enacted at a state level to protect public employees, job creators, and taxpayers? Before we get started, just know that more information on all of these policies are available at mackinac.org and workersforopportunity.org. With that, let's get into some of the other model policies that can be enacted at a state level. The first, we have dues checkoff prohibitions. This stops the government from being the bills collector for union dues. It stops public sector union dues. It stops public employees from having union dues taken from their paychecks, and we've seen a lot of mischief happen with that process. Another concept is called worker voting rights, or union recertification. This requires government unions to periodically stand for re-election. Just like you vote for president, just like you vote for Congress, governor, state legislature, workers should have the right to periodically vote for their union. And this can actually be done for state employees or public employees at a state level. Now, just to put things in perspective, in Michigan, we did a survey of the 10 largest school districts. And we found that for the most part, the 10 largest school districts in Michigan, most teachers, most school employees, they never voted for the union. In fact, in most cases, it was 0 or 1% of school employees that were employed when the union came in. You're talking about unions that organized in the 60s or the 70s. This isn't just Michigan. This is across most of the country, that the vast majority of public employees never had an opportunity to vote for the union at their workplace. Now, going back to Michigan, when I first saw that statistic, I said, well, I don't want to say 1%. I don't want to say 0. How many school employees were even alive when the union organized? You're talking about a quarter to a third were even alive when the union came in. So this isn't just your parents' union. This is your grandparents' union. And this is why workers need these voting rights. And for public employees, states can enact legislation that says that the union stands for periodic re-election. This type of policy has been passed in Wisconsin, it's been passed in Iowa, and to a degree it's also been passed in Florida. These states give public employees the right to say, yeah, this union's doing a good job, let's keep them. No, this union's doing a bad job, let's vote them out, go with a different union, or go with no union. And that's known as worker voting rights or union recertification. Next concept I want to talk about is called union release time. It's also known as official time for federal employees. These are public employees that are doing union work, in some cases full-time union work, and getting their taxpayer-funded salary. So you could have a teacher that doesn't set foot in the classroom that could be doing full-time union work but getting paid by the school in what's known as release time. Several states have looked at prohibiting release time, and that would simply say that if a public employee wants to do union work, they can, but they either have to take vacation or take unpaid time off, and in which case the union can reimburse them for their time. But the taxpayer will not foot the bill for a public employee to do union work, and once again, in some cases, full-time union work while receiving their taxpayer-funded salary. That's release time at the state level, also known as official time in the federal level. The next concept is called workers' choice. Now, remember when we were talking about right to work, we were talking about the difference between union membership and those represented by the union? Well, the union has that monopoly. And in pushback to right to work, unions like to say, well, we have to represent workers that are not paying us. Well, I would like to be magnanimous and say, you know what, unions, if you don't want to represent workers that aren't paying you, you don't have to. Let them represent themselves. Let them act like the almost 87% of the rest of the workers in the economy that are not represented by union and negotiate their own contract. Once again, this can be done at a state level for public employees, letting them out of the union contract and letting them represent themselves. Workers' choice gives public employees the right to say no thanks to unwanted union representation. It gives unions the ability to also say goodbye to workers that don't want the representation and don't want to pay them. It's a much fairer system, and it would allow public employees that want to represent themselves, that want to act like that 87% of the rest of the workers in the economy, to do so and get out of the union contract. There are also states that have enacted union transparency laws, very similar to the ones that were passed at the federal level with the LMRDA like we were talking about before, with those LM forms, specifically the form LM2. State legislation can say that just like private sector union members are entitled to see how their unions are spending their money on those LM forms, their public sector brothers and sisters should have those same rights. So essentially, a state can mirror the federal level and say for public sector unions within our state, they have to file the same type of forms. Those are union transparency forms. Going further, some states are also experimenting with open meetings laws, or essentially allowing the public to see what's going on during those public sector union negotiations, because once again, those are affecting taxpayer dollars and public policy, and therefore the public should be allowed to see what's going on. Now, in order to not have meeting disruptions, states can enact provisions that provide for, let's say, closed caption TV or the meetings to be broadcast on the internet, as long as they're public. It doesn't mean that people have to actually be in the negotiating room, as long as they can have access and view it. And they certainly should have access to proposals that are going back and forth so the public can see exactly what's going on, and contracts before they're officially enacted so they can have time to give input. Those are union transparency laws, and accelerating open meetings laws to include collective bargaining negotiations. Also, several states have pushed back against card check. Now, remember that process where an employer could recognize a union through cards, denying them the ability to have a secret ballot election? That intimidation, the coercion that comes along with card check? Well, several states have actually enacted laws that guarantee workers an election and say that, yeah, you can use cards to show that you have majority support, but then you still have to have an election, and an employer cannot recognize a union unless there is an election. That's a Secret Ballot Protection Act, and it's been enacted in several states. Some states are also experimenting with saying that in order to get public funding, such as taxpayer incentives, we'll get to the efficacy of that at a different time. But if you are taking taxpayer incentives, you have to guarantee your employees the right to a secret ballot election, even if you are in the private sector. So those are different types of secret ballot protection acts. So let's recap these reforms. We've talked about the Janus versus AFSCME decision that brought right to work to public employees across the country. We've talked about opt-in legislation that will further enhance those rights and satisfy what Justice Alito called for when he said there has to be that evidence of affirmative consent to take money from a public employee's paycheck. We've talked about right to work that stops a union from getting a private sector worker fired for not paying them. We've talked about dues checkoff prohibitions that would stop the government from being the bills collector for union dues. We've talked about secret ballot protections that would protect workers' right to a secret ballot in a union election and avoid the pitfalls, the intimidation, and the coercion of card check. We've talked about workers' choice, or allowing public employees to fully opt out of union representation and act like the over 87% of other workers in the economy that represent themselves. We've talked about increased transparency for public sector unions, so public employees that are under a union contract can have the same transparency and rights as their private sector brothers and sisters and be able to see the equivalent of an LM form for state or local government unions. And finally, we've also talked about release time or official time reform, or stopping public employees from getting their taxpayer-funded salary while doing union work, and in some cases, full-time union work on the job. So those are just a few examples of the reforms that can be done at a state level. And once again, more information on all of these reforms on mackinac.org and workersforopportunity.org. But now that we've talked about that, what are some hot topics on the federal level? Okay, so now that we've talked about the state level reforms, let's talk about some of the things that are happening at the federal level. There is, unfortunately, a piece of legislation that would vastly tilt the playing field in favor of forced unionism and away from worker freedom. And that's known as the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act. And it would do several things. I'm just going to go through them very quickly and then talk about what a couple of those issues are. First, it would ban right to work for private sector employees across the entire country. So it would prohibit states from enacting laws that protected worker freedom and would allow unions to get private sector workers fired for not paying unions. Now, fortunately, this doesn't apply to the public sector because of the Janus case, but it could take right to work rights away from those private sector employees in the 27 right to work states. It could also expose workers to intimidation and coercion via what we are calling backdoor card check. It doesn't flat out mandate card check, but essentially it is card check light. It would allow unions to go to the NLRB, and we've already talked about how partisan the NLRB could be, and say that an employer did what we talked about, an unfair labor practice, and unless the employer can prove they're innocent, under this legislation, the employer is guilty until proven innocent. The NLRB will recognize the union according to cards. So while it doesn't mandate card check, it essentially is going to make card check the way that most unions organize, because they'll go to a highly partisan NLRB that will say, yeah, the employer did something during the election, and we're just going to recognize the union. It will destroy independent contracting and the gig economy. If you're familiar with what California did with their Assembly Bill 5, essentially calling independent workers employees. Why? So unions can better organize them or more easily organize them. This same type of test is in the PRO Act, and it's something that, unfortunately, Congress has not learned the lesson of what happened in California and is trying to enact across the country. It would allow unions to gerrymander elections to try to organize an employer and win. We were talking about unit. Essentially, you're talking about, let's say, an entire store. Well, if the unions couldn't get, let's say, an entire Macy's store to a majority of those employees to vote for the union, but let's say they could get a majority of people in the women's shoe department to vote for the unions want to create what are known as micro unions, or allowing the union to slice and dice up a collective bargaining unit until they get a piece that allows them to easily get to a majority, and that's how they want to organize. That allows them to get their foot in the door and try to organize the rest of the store. These are known as micro unions, and once again, it's another provision in the PRO Act. It would also attack the franchising industry. There's a concept called joint employer. This says that McDonald's on the corner, that's owned by a small business owner, a franchisee. They own that business, and they're able to dictate terms of employment. They have to comply with some of the larger corporate cleanliness and brand awareness, but for the most part, that's their business. What unions want to say is, no, that's actually not their business. It's their business, but it's also the business of a far distant corporation, a franchisor. And because they jointly employ employees, that essentially the union could go to that franchisor and could say, well, hey, recognize us via card check. Or, by the way, there's a violation, so we want to go for the deep pocket people, so they're going to go for the franchisor. And it would allow unions to essentially target the corporations, but worse, it would take those small business owners out of owning the business and turn them into managers. We heard one story of a man named Damon Dunn, who is a Dunkin' franchise owner, Dunkin' Donuts franchise owner. And he made a great analogy. He said that he owns his business. He's able to make 6 figures off of owning a Dunkin' Donuts franchise. But if joint employer goes through, he goes from a $200,000 a year owner to a $50,000 manager. The real tragedy of joint employer is that it'll turn owners into managers. It'll turn people that own their own business into simply another corporate employee without control of the store that they've worked on, in some cases owned for years or a generation or more. That's the problem with joint employer. And unions are pushing it simply to make organizing easier. Another issue with the PRO Act is it would also expose workers to more intimidation and coercion, even above and beyond the backdoor card check. The PRO Act would have employers share personal contact information with unions, home addresses, personal emails, cell phones. And workers couldn't opt out. They would have to allow the unions to contact them, to try to organize them, even at home. Once again, the PRO Act, very one-sided, favoring unions over job creators and especially over workers. One more thing, and I won't get into too many more details on the PRO Act because it is the smorgasbord of bad ideas, and there's a lot of them in there, is it does the thing called secondary, it allows what's known as secondary boycotts. So right now there's a law that says that you cannot boycott a second company if you're trying to organize a primary company. So for instance, you can't boycott a trucking company if you're trying to organize, let's say, who they're driving for or their supplier. this would lift that, which could lead to substantial disruptions in the supply chain and essentially allow unions to bully and strong-arm companies that they're not even trying to organize or that really aren't even in their crosshairs, all to strong-arm their target to either drive away their customers or make it difficult for their suppliers to function. That's secondary boycotts. So now, why am I going into so many details besides the fact that the PRO Act is probably the biggest wish list for organized labor at a federal level? It's that a lot of these issues will probably come up administratively. The gig economy issue, joint employer, a lot of that we think will happen either at the Department of Labor or the National Labor Relations Board. And currently the Biden administration may try to do that via administrative action, even if they can't get the PRO Act passed in Congress. So a lot of the things that I just described could happen by either Department of Labor rulemaking. It could happen either from a case decision or from administrative fiat or rulemaking from the National Labor Relations Board. So that's why I wanted to go into so much detail on the different aspects of the PRO Act. Another issue with the PRO Act is something called the ambush election rule. The ambush election rule will speed up, and once again, with the PRO Act, we're all talking about private sector unions here. It would speed up the private sector union election process to, in some cases, something like 2 weeks, from usually about a month to 6 weeks as it is now. Why does this matter? It's because in a lot of cases, employers don't even have any idea that a union is trying to organize them and is only alerted to the fact when they receive that union petition. So I want you to think of a presidential election. Imagine one candidate is campaigning for months or a year or more, and the other candidate doesn't even know he's in the race, let alone that there is a race, until a week or two before the election. That's essentially what the ambush election would do to employers. Not to mention, there's a whole rubric of rules of things that employers cannot do during a unionization election that most employers, even using common sense, would not realize. So it opens employers up to a lot of liability, speeds up the election process, and once again, makes it much easier for a union to come in and organize workers, whether those workers want to be organized or not. The last concept that I want to talk about that we're watching at a federal level, and frankly is coming down at a state level as well, is a concept called sectoral bargaining. It's a concept that's been borrowed from Europe and some other parts of the world, but unfortunately it's not what's actually happening in Europe and some other parts of the world, but it's actually what the proponents want it to be. And essentially that is allowing unions to negotiate or government agencies to set wages and working conditions for entire industries. We've seen this concept start bubbling up in several proposals from Congress, several reports from Congress, and we've also seen a couple of states start dipping their toe in the water. New York, for instance, actually has wage boards for certain industries, such as the fast food industry, where they can do a hyper-specific minimum wage. But with sectoral bargaining, at least what the proponents envision sectoral bargaining to be, it would allow unions to negotiate for an entire industry. So for example, Southern auto workers that have repeatedly rejected the UAW could be stuck under a UAW negotiated contract because they are the quote-unquote union of record for auto workers. So sectoral bargaining is another issue that we're keeping a very close eye on right now, and maybe something that starts bubbling up in the near future. So we've talked about a lot of bad legislation that's coming down the pike on the federal level, and some bad administrative decisions or bad rulemaking from the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board. So what's good out there? What is positive? There is a concept, it hasn't been introduced as of this recording, called the Employee Rights Act, which would do several things to protect worker freedom. First, it would guarantee secret ballot elections. We've talked about the dangers of card check. It would do away with card check and say that if a union wants to organize, they just have to win an election. And employees private sector employees are guaranteed the right to a secret ballot. The next provision of the Employee Rights Act is union recertification for private sector workers. It's a little different than the annual recertification that we've seen in Iowa and Wisconsin. Essentially, it says that when the number of workers that were there when the union organizes drops below 50%, then that triggers a union recertification election. It also provides for a secret ballot vote for strike votes. It also has political protection. So an opt-in for any dues money that's not going to collective bargaining, essentially the difference between agency fees and dues, that direct political portion, that would be an opt-in for private sector employees. It also has employee privacy protections. So employees can opt out of having their information shared with unions during a union organizing campaign. It criminalizes union threats. Unions can actually threaten violence and in some cases enact violence in what's known as a furtherance of a union objective, according to an old Supreme Court case called the Emmons decision. So it would say that no, unions can't threaten, they can't do violence, even if it's in the furtherance of a union objective, that criminal threats are criminal threats and criminal actions are criminal actions, and those are illegal. It would also make it easier for workers to decertify their union and prevent unions from coercing workers when they're trying to say, yeah, we want a different union, or this union isn't doing a good job and we want to go in a different direction. So that's the Employee Rights Act. There's several other bills that have been introduced and that will be introduced at the federal level. And once again, we'll have a lot more information on that at workersforopportunity.org or Mackinac.org, the Mackinac Center's website. So folks, we've had some fun. That's Labor 101. We've gone through a lot of territory today. Thanks for sticking with us. And once again, if you do have any questions, contact info is at the end of this video. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to work with you one-on-one. Thank you very much.